The history of the Christian Church is intertwined with the history of the Roman Empire to a large degree. The development of many doctrines arose directly from the actions taken by the Roman government over the course of the first 3 centuries after Christ. Many of the teachings that have divided the various denominations find their roots in early church history. Largely, the Roman persecution was the reason behind certain practices' development in the early church. These practices would develop into traditions and then into doctrines. Though the Roman Empire is now notorious for persecuting Christians, it was not always done in a systematic or continuous way. It largely depended on the personal goals of the reigning emperor, most of whom wished to restore the glory of the empire. This is especially true during the 2nd and 3rd centuries when the Roman Empire was in serious decline. Earliest persecution was from the Jews rather than from the Roman government. Early Christians saw themselves as Jews who believed the Messiah had come in the person of Jesus. The other Jews believed that the Messiah had not yet come. These unbelieving Jews saw Christians as a heretical sect and, as such, risked the nation of Israel being sent into exile again by God. The Romans did not get involved in this dispute unless it was deemed a risk to public safety, which we know from Acts 18:14 through 15 that one such occasion and emphasis did happen. Persecution was largely only from the Jews in the beginning. Roman persecution started with Emperor Nero after the fire in Rome started in 64 AD and would continue until Emperor Constantine came roughly 250 years later. Again, this was not a continuous persecution from the Roman government. Emperor Nero began his persecution because he was being blamed for the fire in Rome in 64. Whether or not he actually believed the Christians had started the fire doesn't really matter much, as he blamed the Christians as a scapegoat and had them persecuted. Well, many people believe that he was one of the worst persecutors of the church, and he was indeed a persecutor of the Christians around Rome. His persecution was largely confined to Rome. It didn't spread through the other provinces, and after a time came to an end. It wouldn't be until the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 100s that there would exist an official policy on how to deal with Christians. This policy would state that Christians were not actively sought out for persecution and death, but if Christians were accused of other crimes, they were ordered by the court to worship the emperor and the Roman pantheon of gods. If the Christians refused, they faced death more for contempt of court rather than for actually any other crime that they may have committed. Much of the persecution was based on very local politics. If a neighbor did not like a Christian, they could accuse them of a crime. Then when they were brought into the Roman court, they would face the choice of worshiping the emperor and the gods. Mistrust grew in the population due to a misunderstanding of what Christians believed. Rumors went around that Christians practiced incest and cannibalism due to Christians referring to each other as brother and sister, even those who were married. The other one, cannibalism, was believed that in taking communion or eating Christ's flesh and drinking his blood, that they were actually eating and drinking flesh. In the last half of the 3rd century, there would be 3 notable emperors who would persecute the church. The first of these was Decius. He had the goal of reuniting the empire after a civil war. He sought to do this by restoring the old religion. He did not want to create martyrs. Instead, torture was the method he used to try to coerce people to recant. Under the pressure, many people did lapse. After the persecution ended, there were many Christians who reaffirmed their faith. The question was what to do with the people who came back. In trying to answer this question, the church would divide, especially in the western half of the empire where the persecution was worse. It was in trying to answer this question of the lapse that would lead to the development of the penitential system that the Protestant Reformation would later protest against. Decius would reign for a mere 2 years. and then he was replaced by Emperor Gallus, who also reigned for 2 years. Then was succeeded by Valerian, who would rule for 7 years and briefly revive the persecution that Decius had brought. However, after Emperor Valerian, the church would have a break in persecution for about 50 years. The last and worst persecution took place under Emperor Diocletian. When he came to power, he revamped the political structure of the empire. He retitled himself Augustus and retained supreme authority and ruled 1/4 directly of the empire. He set up 3 under-emperors whom he called Caesars in the other portions of the empire. It would be under Caesar Galerius that the last and worst persecution would start. It started with the question of whether Christians should serve in the army, as Galerius's portion of the empire bordered the Germanic tribes, who were a constant threat to the power and stability of the empire. This was a serious matter for him. There was no general agreement among Christians regarding military service, for, while most church leaders of the time said that Christians should not be soldiers, there were many believers in the legions. In any case, around AD 295, a number of Christians were condemned to death, some for refusing to join the army and others for trying to leave it. Galerius saw this attitude of Christians toward military service as a serious danger, for it was conceivable that at a critical moment the Christians in the army would refuse to obey orders. Therefore, as a measure required for military morale, Galerius convinced Diocletian that all Christians should be expelled from the legions. Diocletian's edict did not order any further penalty for Christians besides expulsions from the ranks of the military. But in some areas, probably due to an excess of zeal on the part of some officers who did not wish to see their ranks thinned, there were attempts to force Christian soldiers to deny their faith. The result was a number of executions, all of them in the army of the Danube under the command of Galerius. The situation for Christians became worse when they were expelled from all government offices under Galerius and then Diocletian. They were also blamed for a series of fires in the capital city. In 304, Diocletian became ill. Though he survived, Galerius managed to force him to abdicate. Galerius also forced one of the other Caesars to abdicate, and ended up splitting power with the third Caesar, whose name was Constantinus Chlorus. They both shared the title of Augustus and had 2 Caesars underneath them, though both of these were the puppets of Galerius. This was an uneasy political situation, and though Galerius tried to increase his power, he was eventually forced to try to broker a peace, and the retired emperor, Diocletian, would do so. In 311 AD, Galerius would rescind the order for persecution, since he was the one largely responsible for its issuance in the first place. After Constantinus Chlorus died, his son, Constantine, would take his place in the far western portion of the empire in what is today Great Britain, France, Spain, and Morocco. The rise of Constantine and the imperial church will be dealt with in the next lesson on Roman history.